Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we come to the Russian Revolution, one of the major outcomes of World War I, one of the major effects of all of this, and one of the most monumental events in world history. So, today we'll introduce the Bolsheviks and Vladimir Lenin and talk about how they managed to seize control of the Russian Empire, forever changing the course of world history. So, let's dive in. Here's our objectives for today. Take a moment, take them in, and we'll move forward. As we hopefully remember from previous lessons, the Czars' rule in Russia had not been particularly stable. The Russo-Japanese War was a spectacular embarrassment for the Tsar, leading to the Revolution of 1905. His power had already been limited, and his vision, the way he was viewed by the Russian people, had pretty substantially changed since the Russo-Japanese War. Especially Bloody Sunday, where Bloody Sunday, where Russian troops opened fire on demonstrators throughout Petrograd, really created some pretty significant problems for the Tsar. And as Father Gapon, one of the activists in the Revolution of 1905, notes, his opinion of the Tsar has just shifted slightly. Reptilian progeny. It did create the Duma in the aftermath of this. So the Russian Revolution created this thing called the One of the effects of the Revolution of 1905 was the creation of an actual Russian legislature known as the Duma. Much like most of the other legislators created during this time period, it was divided up immediately into a bunch of different factions. Of course, you had a conservative czarist faction, your Black Hundred supporting the Tsar. At the same time, you also had some of your liberal nobles, your cadets, who were pushing for free trade, for full citizenship, modernization, stuff like that. And then you've got your socialist parties. The socialist movement in Russia was divided up into the Mensheviks, who wanted to compete at elections and push for reform. They were eventually going to take control of the government through legislative means and then push forward their socialist agenda. And then the group that eventually succeeded, the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks were much more radical during this time period. They were hoping to eventually, they did run some candidates for election, but for the most part, they were pushing for violent revolution. One of their leaders was Vladimir Lenin here, who started to believe in this whole idea of party vanguardism, the idea that they needed to overthrow the government first, and then the Russian people would come along with them. They were also going to embrace terrorist activities and other and bank robberies and that sort of stuff. One of the guys who was brought in to do that was Comrade Koba, also known as Joseph Stalin here. He had a number of audacious bank robberies and attacking of armored carriages to steal money to help finance the Bolsheviks' activities. And as far as propaganda goes, Leon Trotsky was one of the most famous Bolsheviks, writing sort of the philosophical piece of this, trying to win the war of ideas. So You've got the iron will of Lenin, you've got the violence and the organization of Stalin, you've got the ideas of Trotsky. The Bolsheviks were a powerful force within the Russian Revolution, but during this time period, they were a minority party. They were only a small group of people who were associated with this larger Russian reform movement. So, the context for this revolution is the war is not going particularly well for Russia. Nicholas II is going to go and take direct command of the armies, and this is about the time that Germany is going to decide that they need to throw some weight at the Russians. And so they're going to start putting significant pressure on the Russians, and the effect of Nicholas going to the front is twofold. One, it removes him from the leadership in Petrograd, in St. Petersburg, and takes him out of the decision-making process. And two, it makes it appear as if all military defeats are his fault, which are going to further illegitimize him in the eyes of his people. Unfortunately, the other thing that delegitimizes him is most of the governing in Petrograd is now going to be done by his wife, Alexandra, who has fallen even more under the sway of Rasputin, who is the sort of religious faith healer who had been treating his son Alexei for hemophilia. And so eventually Russian nobles decide they need to remove and assassinate Rasputin. If you're interested in this, you should go read the story. But apparently they tried to poison him, and then they shot him, and then they stabbed him, and then he still ran away and ended up falling through the ice on a river and drowning. So the story of the Rasputin who wouldn't die is one of the sort of legends of Russian history. But either way, even with Rasputin gone, the Tsarina Alexandra is going to keep leading things in Russia and is going to keep pushing back on any attempt to reform, change strategy, or do any of that. And so Russia facing spectacular inflation, scarcity, the collapse of their economy, the collapse of their military. Basically, everyone is screaming at the Tsar and his wife that you need to reform something. You need to bring in new ministers. You need to set in some new policies. You've got to do something. This is not going well for us. We can't feed our people and we're losing the war. But the Tsar and the Tsarina refuse all reform. They've isolated themselves in a bubble of sycophants who just simply tell them what they want to hear, and they utterly refuse to reform and change anything, basically paving the way for revolution. Even pro-Tsarist nobles start to write letters to Alexander telling him that your government is falling, this is a disastrous problem. And so Nicholas tries to come back from the front, but on the way there, he's told that the whole thing is falling apart. And in the end, he attempts to abdicate and puts his brother in charge to try to run the government as we figure out this new transition. This overthrow of the Tsar is known as the February Revolution, and it's going to lead to ostensibly the Russian people taking over Russia, although exactly what that means is somewhat complicated. And so what we're going to get is a provisional government controlled by the legislature, by the Duma, that is going to try to continue and create this war policy. The problem is you've got this thing called dual power, where on the one hand, you've got this elected legislature, and on the other hand, you've got what's called the Petrograd Soviet, which is an organization of soldiers and workers in the city of St. Petersburg, which is also meeting separate from the legislature and coming up with their own policies. This divide is called dual power, where the Soviet and the legislature are theoretically working together, but sometimes they're issuing cross-purpose decrees, and it's not clear who the legitimate sort of governing body of the people is. Is it the elected legislature, or is it this informal council of workers in the capital that has significant military power, arms, and authority? The guy who comes out on top of the legislature is a guy named Alexander Kerensky, who's eventually going to become the head of this provisional government. He's going to call for patience from the Soviet and from the Russian people. He's going to say, we are going to reform this stuff, but right now we need to win the war. We need aid from the Allies. We cannot have our government collapse or get taken over by the Germans. We need to move forward here together, or else we're going to fall apart. Unfortunately, Kerensky is not the most charismatic guy, and the whole thing is going to collapse. The only reason he stays in power is the support of the military, and he's eventually going to be hopelessly undermined by the return of Vladimir Lenin, who Lenin had been in exile, and as part of a plan to destabilize the Russian Empire, the Kaiser of Germany is actually going to help smuggle him back into the country to have him hopefully overthrow the government and end the war. The Bolsheviks tried really, really hard to hide this fact because it made him and by extension the Bolsheviks seem like traitors. But the return of Lenin and division within the Petrograd Soviet and within the provisional government is eventually going to lead to Kerensky's fall, especially when, again, Lenin returns. Here we go. Here's Lenin's articles that he's writing. So pause, take this in. He's demanding now all power to the Soviets. Kerensky also attempts to launch a military offensive, which basically leads to one, Kerensky seizing total power of the government, and two, massive mutinies racking the Russian military. So the Russian army is going to start mutinying. They're going to start shooting their officers. They're going to start refusing to fight any longer and heading back to the cities. And so now, in addition to dealing with everything else, you're dealing with a looming German invasion. You're dealing with a mutinous army and a group of revolutionaries prepared to overthrow the government. The first attempt to overthrow the government is known as the July Days. The Bolsheviks rise up in Petrograd and try to seize control of the government, but they do not yet have the backing of the Petrograd Soviet and the soldiers. And so the July Days fail. Many of the Bolshevik leaders are arrested. Lenin has to flee again, and the Bolsheviks are disarmed. And so it seems like that might be the revolution. It might be over. Russia's probably going to lose the war to Germany, but the Bolsheviks are done. And then the Kornilov Affair happens. a Russian general named Kornilov has a split with Kerensky and decides he's going to seize absolute power. So he raises his army and prepares to march on Petrograd in order to seize control of the Russian government. In order to fight back against this, the Russian provisional government decides to rearm the Bolsheviks, forming what are called the Red Guards, this army of Bolshevik soldiers that they give weapons to. The Kornilov Affair then sort of peters out. It turns out Kornilov didn't really have support of the army behind him, and so he fails in his attempt to become dictator. But now you've got all these armed Bolsheviks in Petrograd who then now have the power, the will, and the moment to attempt to seize power. Here's Lenin's favorite call to power in October. And so at this moment, Lenin and the Bolsheviks seize control of the government, seize control of Petrograd, and declare their new platform. They are now going to be the Union. They're going to create this new country called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. I mean, it's a longer process. We're not totally there yet. But the Bolsheviks have seized control in Petrograd in the October Revolution, and now they're in charge. Once they take over, all the other communist parties and socialist parties expect that it's going to be a shared government between all of them. As you can see here, the Bolsheviks are only one small group within the Russian National Assembly, within the legislature. And so there's all these other groups, the SRs, other nationalist parties, other, ethnic groups having parties, things like that. And so there's this assumption that power is going to be shared by all these groups, but the Bolsheviks are going to pretty quickly crack down on all of these other parties by, one, issuing a land decree. They're going to take the position of the SRs and they're going to nationalize all land to try to get the peasants on their side. So that's one piece. They're going to do this to attempt to get the peasants on their side. They're going to negotiate a peace treaty with Germany called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk here, where we establish a new armistice line and get Russia out of the war to get soldiers on their side. And so, although they don't necessarily agree to stop fighting with Germany, they do agree to this peace treaty where Germany is going to occupy a ton of land, and this is going to end the war. And then they're going to send out representatives called the People's Commissars and their secret police called the Cheka to eliminate all opposition. They're going to crack down and make illegal all other political parties. The People's Commissars are going to seize control of local governments, and their secret police are going to execute anyone who goes against them. And so with an iron will and absolute ruthlessness, Lenin is going to quickly eliminate his enemies. He's going to bring all of the other communist revolutionaries before these tribunals, have them arrested, have them tried, and then have them found guilty and shot. And so he's going to purge the SRs from government. And he's going to seize grain from the peasants in order to try to feed the cities. These grain requisitions are incredibly unpopular, but in the end, with the Red Army and the Red Guards on their side, and with the Cheka roaming around killing anyone who stands against them, all of these peasant rebellions are going to be pretty quickly put down, and the Bolsheviks are going to seize control at least of the central government in the cities. In order to stop people from pushing back against them, Lenin is then going to declare that he's going to have absolute control over information, abolishing freedom of the press. And then finally, we have a red terror where any peasant opposing the government, any SR who's still running around, all of them are going to be rounded up and killed. This gets even worse after an SR attempts to assassinate Lenin and he survives, and the Bolsheviks decide to crack down on all dissent within Russia. Here's the famous hanging order for the kulaks. So take a moment, read this, and then we'll move on. And so that's the beginning of the Russian Revolution. Now you've got a variety of different forces in Russia. We've still got a pretty prolonged civil war that we'll be talking about going forward. But for now, Russia's out of the war, and at least the cities of Petrograd and Moscow are under the control of the Bolsheviks. And this story is going to get much more complicated going forward. So for tomorrow, we'll come back, we'll end the war and bring it to a close, and then start looking at the aftermath. But for now, thank you for listening.